What happened when no white man returned alive? From the giant widow's tent until a wealthy rancher dared to stay. Witness this unbelievable, true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The winds of New Mexico carried whispers of many things: gold, cattle, death, and legends older than the railroad. But no tale haunted the men of the frontier quite like the one of the giant widow. Travelers spoke of her in hushed tones by campfires. Outlaws cursed her name while gambling, and sheriffs drank whiskey to forget the men who never came back once they ventured near her tent. Her story had grown over the years like a desert storm, impossible to pin down, yet impossible to escape. She was said to be a woman taller than most men, broad-shouldered, strong enough to split a log with her bare hands. Some swore she was 7 feet tall, others claimed her head nearly touched the beams of her tent. She had hair as dark as a raven's wing, falling down her back like a storm cloud, and eyes that burned in the night with the light of something unearthly. She was called the widow because no man lasted by her side. They came with promises, with lust, with arrogance, and with fear. But by dawn they were always gone. Horses returned riderless, possessions lay scattered in the sand, and the men themselves vanished as though swallowed by the desert. Some claimed she was half Apache, a woman born of warrior blood and cursed by white soldiers she once defied. Others whispered she was a spirit of vengeance, sent by the earth itself to punish men who dared to take what did not belong to them. There were even stories that she had once been a wife to a great chief, and when he fell in battle, her grief turned her into something more than human, something that fed on the pride of foolish men. The sheriff of Lincoln County had once sent 2 deputies to investigate after 3 drifters vanished on their way to Texas. They never returned. A posse tried once, but the desert swallowed them too. Since then, no lawman had dared interfere. The widow's tent was marked in silence on every map of the West, an unspoken warning, a ghostly border no one crossed. For years the story remained only a tale, a shadow told to keep cowboys from wandering too far into the desert at night. Until the day a man named Clinton McGraw arrived. Clinton was no ordinary drifter. He was a wealthy cattle rancher out of Abilene, Kansas, a man who had driven herds from Texas to Missouri and built a fortune out of sweat, steel, and sheer determination. He wasn't a gambler nor a man reckless with drink. He was a man of calculation, grit, and pride, the kind who knew the value of land, cattle, and courage. With his black Stetson, polished boots, and silver spurs, he carried the presence of someone who belonged to the frontier, yet stood above it. He came into Lincoln County with talk of buying land and expanding his empire, but soon the whispers of the giant widow reached his ears. Most men chuckled nervously when they spoke of her, shaking their heads, warning him to stay away. But McGraw only leaned back in his chair at the saloon, sipped his whiskey, and said one line that carried across the room like a bullet. "Every man's got his last ride. If mine's in her tent, so be it." The room went silent. A few laughed nervously, thinking he was jesting, but when they saw the seriousness in his grey eyes, they stopped. A silence fell heavy as dust, the kind that follows a pistol drawn too quick. He meant it. Clinton McGraw was going to the widow that evening. As the sun set in blazing streaks of orange and red across the desert sky, McGraw saddled his best horse, a tall chestnut stallion named Duke. He packed little, a canteen, a rifle he didn't expect to use, and a silver watch that had once belonged to his father. As he tightened the reins, an old prospector named Harlan hobbled up, his voice raspy with age. "Rancher," he croaked, "you don't know what you're walking into. She ain't no woman like others. She's death in flesh." McGraw swung into the saddle, his jaw set firm. "Maybe so, but death comes for every man. Better I meet it on my own terms." With that, he rode out of town, leaving behind the dim glow of lanterns, the sound of piano keys, and the muttered prayers of men who doubted they'd ever see him again. The desert stretched wide and silent, the air cool as night fell. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the moon rose full, casting silver shadows across the dry riverbeds and rocky plains. Hours passed until finally, just before midnight, McGraw saw the faint glow of fire ahead. There it was, the widow's tent. It stood at the edge of a dry arroyo, canvas flapping gently in the breeze, lit from within by a lantern that glowed like an ember. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and imposing, her silhouette unmistakable. McGraw slowed his horse, studying her. She did not flinch, did not retreat. She waited. When he dismounted, the earth beneath his boots felt heavier than ever, as though he were stepping into a place outside of time. The widow spoke first, her voice deep, carrying a strange mix of power and sadness. "No man survives me, rancher," she said. "Turn back before the desert takes you too." McGraw's hand rested on his saddle horn, steady as stone. "Maybe that's because no man stayed." Her eyes glinted in the moonlight, and for the first time, the faintest curl of a smile touched her lips. She turned and stepped into the tent, leaving the flap open. McGraw tied his horse, adjusted his hat, and followed. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of sage and smoke. Rugs lined the ground, furs were spread along the edges, and the glow of the lantern cast flickering shadows against the canvas walls. She poured him a drink from a clay jug, her massive hand trembling slightly as she handed it over. He accepted without hesitation, drinking deep. They sat across from each other, silent at first. Her presence was overwhelming, not only in size but in spirit. She looked at him as though measuring the weight of his soul. "You are not afraid?" she asked finally. "Fear doesn't change a thing," McGraw answered. "It only makes a man die before his time." The night stretched long. She asked about his ranch, his cattle, his wives. He told her both had died, one from fever, the other from childbirth. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke of her people, of betrayal, of men who had come with promises only to recoil at her size, her strength, her difference. Fear always turned into hate, and hate into blood. McGraw did not flinch. He only leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Then maybe you were cursed by cowards, not by God." For the first time, her mask cracked. Something human, something vulnerable flickered in her eyes. But the night was far from over. Outside, the wind howled through the desert, and inside the tent, the air grew heavy with tension. Two souls, bound by fate and legend, sat across from each other as though the world itself held its breath. And as the lantern burned low, no one in the county could guess what dawn would bring. The lantern burned lower as the hours passed, its glow flickering like a heartbeat against the canvas walls. Outside, the desert night carried the sounds of coyotes crying, of wind whistling through canyons. But inside the tent, silence pressed between them, heavier than stone. McGraw sat steady, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his eyes fixed on the woman across from him. She was not what the legends had painted. Not entirely monster, not entirely woman either, but something beyond both. Her size was undeniable, her strength visible in every line of her arms and hands. Yet there was a weariness in her posture, a grief that weighed heavier than her body. She studied him as one would study a storm rolling across the plains, wary but curious, measuring how much destruction it might bring. "Do you know," she said finally, her voice low and rough, "how many men have sat where you sit now?" McGraw swirled the drink in his hand, the clay cup cool against his palm. "Enough to make you a legend," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "A curse, not a legend. They came with hunger in their eyes, some with greed, some with lust, but all of them left their fear behind when dawn came. Fear turns men cruel. They feared me, and cruelty leaves blood." She reached for a knife beside her, its blade long and curved, the kind used for skinning hides. McGraw did not move. She dragged the blade slowly across her palm, not cutting, only tracing the line of an old scar. Each one thought they could own me, tame me, or worse, kill me when they realized they could not. "I buried them in the sand where the coyotes roam now." Her words hung like smoke. McGraw did not flinch, nor did he reach for the rifle propped near him. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe that's because none of them came as they were. They wanted to make you smaller. They wanted to bend you to fit their world. A man who can't face what's real doesn't deserve to face the dawn. For the first time, her shoulders eased. She tilted her head, her dark hair sliding over her cheek. "And what do you come for, rancher?" McGraw considered his answer. He could have said pride or curiosity or even death, but none would have been true. He came because the story dared him to. He came because the frontier broke weaker men, and he was determined never to be broken. He came because deep down, he knew he had wrestled cattle, storms, and loneliness, but never had he stared into a force like her. "I came," he said slowly, "to meet the truth behind the whisper. And here you are." The words seemed to stir something in her, as though he had reached into a locked chest she had guarded for years. Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost fragile. "You are the first who has not looked at me with disgust. Even my own husband, the one they call Fallen Chief, he feared me in the end. And when he fell in battle, I carried his name but not his love. Since then I have been only widow, never woman." McGraw set down his cup and met her eyes without wavering. "Maybe you've been waiting for someone not to fear you. Maybe the curse was never yours but theirs." The lantern sputtered, and the silence between them turned heavy again. But this time, it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people bound by something greater than chance. The hours dragged into the depths of night. She spoke of her past, of raids and betrayals, of soldiers who took and burned, of the night she first spilled blood to survive. He spoke of cattle drives that lasted weeks, of the emptiness of wealth when a man's house echoes hollow, of graves dug for wives before their time. Pain met pain, grief met grief, until the distance between them grew smaller. At one point, she reached for his hand. Her fingers were thick, calloused, yet trembling, as though afraid he might pull away. He did not. He let her hand rest against his, smallness against enormity. And for the first time since her curse began, she did not feel like a creature, but like a woman. Outside, the first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon. The wind had quieted the desert still. She rose to her feet, towering over him, her face unreadable. "This is the hour," she whispered. "When they see the truth and choose death or betrayal, what will you do, rancher?" McGraw stood, his hat casting a shadow across his face. He stepped close, so close that the top of his head barely reached her shoulders. He looked up at her with the calmness of a man who had made peace with his fate. "I will walk out with the sun," he said. Her chest rose sharply, her breath unsteady. The moment hung like a blade ready to fall. Then slowly she lowered her knife, her hands trembling as though shedding centuries of grief. "Then you will be the first," she whispered. When the sun broke the horizon, its light spilling across the desert like liquid gold, the flap of the widow's tent stirred. For the first time in living memory, a man stepped out alive. Clinton McGraw emerged steady, his horse waiting where he had left it, his face calm but changed, as though he carried something more than survival. The townsfolk gasped when they saw him return. Men who had bet silver coins on his death dropped their glasses in shock. The sheriff stared from his office window, shaking his head as though seeing a ghost. McGraw said little when they asked, only that the widow was not what they thought. "She's flesh and blood," he told them. "She's sorrow, not sin. And she ain't the one cursed, we are." From that day on, the whispers changed. No longer was she only the giant widow who devoured men. She became a story of mystery, of forbidden strength, of a woman who spared one man and walked into history with him. McGraw visited her often, riding into the desert under the cover of dusk, and each time he returned, alive and steady. Some said he loved her, others claimed she became his secret wife. None dared follow, none dared question, because fear no longer ruled the tale. Respect did. The desert still held her tent, still lit by a lantern at night, still marked by silence. But the story shifted. Where once men spoke of bones and curses, they now spoke of courage and truth. McGraw had broken the chain, and in doing so, he had turned a ghost story into a legend of two souls who found each other in a world that never wanted them whole. The giant widow lived on, not as a monster, but as a myth of strength, sorrow, and the night she met a rancher who dared stay when no one else would. And Clinton McGraw lived the rest of his days carrying the memory of her in silence, never betraying her secret, never fearing what the world would say. For in the end, he had seen the truth behind the whisper, and sometimes that truth is all a man needs to tame death itself.